Good evening. I'm Mark Updegrove, the director of the LBJ Library, and on behalf of our partner in tonight's event, the Texas Tribune, I want to welcome you all. Last month marked the 160th birthday of the New York Times, which virtually throughout its august history has been a beacon of journalistic integrity and excellence. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome Bill Keller, who has spent over a quarter of a century at the Gray Lady, where until last month, he served as executive editor, the paper's highest editorial post. Bill started his career at the Times in 1984 as a domestic correspondent in the Washington Bureau. He then went on to become the paper's Moscow bureau chief, where he won the Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the Soviet Union in 1989. Bill then served as Johannesburg bureau chief before becoming the paper's foreign editor, managing editor, and then executive editor in 2003. Bill continues to contribute to the New York Times Magazine and the Times News Sunday Opinion and News section, the Sunday Review. Texas is not entirely foreign territory to Bill. Among his first jobs was as a reporter for the Dallas Times-Herald, where he worked for 2 years before joining the Times in 1984. Interviewing Bill tonight will be our old friend, Evan Smith. Evan boasts his own impressive journalistic credentials. He was the president and editor-in-chief of Texas Monthly before founding the Texas Tribune, where he serves as CEO and editor-in-chief. Last year, the Texas Tribune began a content partnership with the New York Times, which continues to flourish. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Bill Keller and Evan Smith.
Bill, welcome.
Thank you.
Very nice to have you here.
Normally a crowd this size, you're expected to dance or sing or something.
Right. Or they're just really, really mad. Where's my paper? Right?
Okay. I don't do circulation.
You don't do that? No. Your answer all night is going to be, I don't do advertising, I don't do circulation, I don't do the editorial page.
And I told the journalism school students earlier today I don't do hiring anymore either, so right, their faces fell.
I will not take your resumes. Do not give me a resume. I was thinking about this today, knowing that we'd be sitting down together. In the last 48 hours, Sarah Palin has announced she wouldn't run. Chris Christie has announced he wouldn't run. Steve Jobs died. Reverend Shuttlesworth died. A whole host of other things happened. Don't you wish you were still the editor of the paper?
No, I don't. I don't, actually. Last night I went out for a delicious barbecue dinner, and nobody called to interrupt my dinner to say that Steve Jobs had died. I mean, I'm obviously interested. I will read everything that we and others publish on the subject. But I've spent a lot of my life having to worry about everything, and having the opportunity to be a little more selective is nice.
Yeah, but you were editor for more than 8 years, and I expect that during that time you get into a routine where you think like an editor. It's only been a month. Surely that transition to not thinking like an editor is not complete. It's like you hear a dog whistle and you run.
That is true, but I'm trying to wean myself away from the temptation to say, you know what, that story shouldn't have been on the front page, or why did they lead with that, or why does the Journal have that story and we don't?
Well, wait a minute. Are you reading the New York Times like that now?
No, I'm. It's a process, but I'm not reading it that way most of the time.
Do you read it in print now, or do you read it digitally?
I do both, and have for a long time. I mean, I like print. It's just a great medium. Our art director, Tom Bodkin, at the Times always refers to the newspaper as having a thingness about it, and I sort of know what he means. It's tangible, but I read the paper in the morning, and then I follow updates throughout the day, and if I'm in some place where I can't get the print paper, I read it on my iPad.
Yeah, and you feel like that's a good experience. It's a sufficient substitute for you as you make your way through the paper.
Yes, yeah, it is.
You presided over the paper during years of extraordinary change in the way we consume media. And it's left a lot of people, maybe some people in this audience, certainly some of the people you met at the journalism school today, and frankly, a lot of journalists worried about the future. Would you disabuse us of the idea that all this is going away?
Happily. I mean, I should preface this by saying that, you know, newspaper editors are foolish if they make predictions. But
be foolish.
No, I'm quite confident that obviously not every newspaper, a lot of them are dying off, but there will be good journalism produced into the foreseeable and maybe the unforeseeable future. And the future will be a combination of survivors. I expect the New York Times will be one of them. I think, you know, the Wall Street Journal will be, NPR. You can pick the places that seem stable, relatively well-financed, and truly committed to what they do. And the ones that can adapt technologically and adapt their business model will survive.
Yep.
And the rest of the field will be startups. There will be online news organizations of various kinds. Some of them will be dreadful. Some of them will be, like the Texas Tribune, quite good. And, you know, it's a painful period, like any transition. I have a lot of friends who either aren't working or aren't working at what, you know, with the same kind of impact that they once had. A lot of communities don't have newspapers. A lot of communities that have newspapers don't have reporters doing vitally important business like covering the state capitol. Right. And that's, you know, that's tragic, but I think it's temporary.
In the end, all this endures.
In the end, the law of supply kicks in, and there is absolutely a demand, a need for good journalism, and you know, there will be a supply.
There's a need that is intangible, which is to say that a properly functioning democracy needs this kind of work. But I want to talk about the tangible measure of the demand, and that is first circulation. You and I have visited about this a couple times over the last day. Weekday circulation of the Times right now is at about 917,000, down from 928,000 2 years ago, but down more significantly from a time when it was over 1 million. In fact, I think in 2009 it was down below 1 million for the first time since the 80s.
That's right.
Sunday, the circulation of the Sunday paper is about 1.3 million now, down from 1.4 million 2 years ago. But again, it used to be...
Down from 1.9 million once upon a time.
Down from 1.9 million once upon a time. So on a percentage basis, you could argue that the Times is no different than other papers in that it's showing, if not a precipitous decline, a decline. This doesn't worry you? From a trend line standpoint, it doesn't worry you?
Well, if that was the whole story, it would worry me a lot. Yeah. But against that is the fact that we have, I'm not sure what the most recent numbers are, but something like 40 million unique visitors a month to our website from all over the world.
Right.
Crazy amounts of traffic. And they tend to stay a longer time than they do in a lot of other places.
Right.
And importantly, they're now paying.
Right.
Or at least a lot of them are.
Have you been able to do research? Is it recent enough that maybe this hasn't happened, but maybe you have done this research to determine whether the reader online is reading different things, what the reader online wants versus what the print subscriber or the print buyer wants?
Well, the thing is, you can measure everything online. You know, if we want to, we can tell not only what they read, but how far into the article they read. Right. We don't know what they're reading in print. Yeah. I mean, we don't have really recent survey data to show that. Yeah. And it doesn't, you know, it doesn't bother me if they're reading something different online.
It doesn't affect the choices you might have made as editor. In other words, if you knew that the online audience, which we know, generally speaking, online audiences tend to be younger, if you knew that this massive 40 million uniques wanted a different kind of news than you produced in the paper, you wouldn't do something differently.
No, probably. If they wanted it delivered in a different way, if they'd rather have an iPhone app than a website, we will move towards different delivery system.
But less foreign news and more Jay-Z, for instance. You would not.
No, there's lots of Jay-Z news out there, and sadly, way too little foreign news. And you know, I hate to use the words like brand, but there is a kind of brand identity to the New York Times, and it includes foreign coverage. If we stopped doing it, we wouldn't be the New York Times.
What is? Let me stop you and ask you, for the benefit of everybody here, what is the brand identity of the Times as you see it?
Well, you might get a slightly different answer if you ask the folks at Fox News, but
we'll get to that.
Okay. The brand identity of the New York Times is a serious newspaper that attempts to cover stories in depth, that tries to do it fairly and impartially, that does it by actually deploying live reporters to faraway places,
Yep.
that has an editorial staff that enforces a set of standards, including, these are aspirations, we don't always get them, but including accuracy, including fairness, including readability, and that we care enough about those things that when we get something wrong, we try to go back and correct it. Mm-hmm. I think that's our brand identity. There's the question which you're going to ask, so I'll preempt it, which, isn't the New York Times also branded as a liberal
right.
newspaper?
Why do you hate America was going to be the way that I asked the question.
We have this guy called a public editor, and there have been 4 of them, and they're all guys. And the first of them, a guy named Dan Okrent, delightful guy.
Used to live here?
That's right, he did. Dan once wrote a column, the headline of which is seared on the minds of every person who's ever interviewed me. And the headline was, "Is the New York Times a liberal newspaper?" And the first line of the article was, "Of course it is." He then went on to explain the part that people forget was not that the New York Times was a democratic paper. I mean, yes, our opinion pages, the editorial page tends to be liberal. We have significantly more liberal columnists than conservative columnists.
Right.
The conservative columnists, are disavowed as apostates by the far right because they're in the New York Times. How conservative could they really be?
The New York Times idea of a conservative
Right.
is how they're always branded.
But right. There are token conservatives or our pet conservatives. But what Dan wrote was that we're liberal in the sense that, he didn't put it this way, but sort of in the sense that liberal arts schools are liberal. We have a kind of we're an urban newspaper. We write about evolution as a fact. We don't give equal time to creationism. We include. Sorry.
You may not be in the right state for that.
Yeah, right. And he's right down the street, isn't he?
Yes, maybe.
Okay. All right. I wonder what his science advisor. No, we'll save that subject for another time. We are liberal in the sense that we are open-minded, sort of tolerant, urban. Our weddings page includes, and did even before New York had a gay marriage law, included gay unions. So we're liberal in that sense of the word, I guess.
But he did not mean that you're liberal in the way that Fox News or the Wall Street Journal might perceive the Times to be biased.
No, he didn't mean that we, cut Democrats a lot of slack and persecute Republicans. And if you believe that we cut Democrats slack, I urge you to go ask Bill Clinton or
Anthony Weiner.
Or Anthony Weiner,
right.
Or either of the last 2 governors who were no longer governors of the state of New York.
And lately the president.
And lately the president has gotten some pretty tough.
So I'll ask you directly, and you can answer directly. Does the New York Times have bias in favor of Democrats or liberals?
Aside from the liberal values, sort of social values thing that I talked about, no, I don't think it does. It's a different question whether individual there are surveys that show that people who work in journalism tend to be predominantly liberal in their views of the world. But I know there's a school of thought that this is, nobody's objective. You should just sort of declare your biases up front and be upfront about it. There is a real discipline that I believe in. It's not to sound too highfalutin, but it's not that different from the discipline that a judge has. I know that every judge sitting on the bench has some strong opinions that probably enter into his feelings about defendants and prosecutors and defense lawyers. And judges know that their job is to interpret the law. Maybe they don't do it perfectly all the time. Maybe their biases creep in. But there is a discipline. There's an expectation that as a judge, you're supposed to set your personal biases aside and go by the law. And there's something comparable in journalism. You may or may not like a particular politician. You may or may not agree with a particular policy. But you not only are disciplined to try and suppress that, you're actually taught to report against it.
And
if you have a going-in, point of view, the first person you talk to is the guy who's going to tell you that point of view is nonsense.
And you're satisfied that your reporters stick to that philosophy?
I mean, To say I'm satisfied would suggest a level of complacency, and I think it requires constant discipline. That's why everything that goes into the paper gets edited, and it gets edited by multiple people. And one of the things editors are looking for are those sort of telltale signs that, yes, there are two sides of the story, but we sort of know which side the reporter's on. Mm-hmm. And you try very hard to root those out.
Does the Wall Street Journal play as straight as you're describing the New York Times playing?
Some of my colleagues would say no. I think mostly yes. I mean, there have been, occasions, and I don't know whether these were dictated from editors on high or what, but for a while the Journal used to use the code word death taxes for the estate tax, which is, that is the slogan version of what the estate tax is. There's no statute that describes it as a death tax. And there've been.
And you mean in the news pages?
In the news pages, not in the editorial pages.
Right.
And when you read something like that, you think, well, oh my God, it's jarring to the eye to read that sort of thing. But I think those are. I have other criticisms of what's happened to the Journal since Rupert Murdoch took it over, but I do not think there was some alarm, given that he also owns Fox News, given the tendencies of some of his papers in other countries, that the Wall Street Journal was going to become a kind of vehicle for right-wing propaganda masquerading as fair news.
Well, right down the street, you got the New York Post. I mean, the
Right.
fact is Murdoch has probably done a version of that right there, right?
Sure. Well, yes, the New York Post has been, a tabloid that makes no bones about its politics for a long time. But the Journal has not, I don't think, been corrupted in that way. They've done some other things that I wish they hadn't. They've cut back significantly on the investigative reporting that used to be a real mainstay of the Journal. There was Robert Thompson, who's the editor, sort of famously issued an instruction upon taking office that he didn't want any more of these stories that had the gestation period of a llama. Well, I had to look it up. The gestation period of a llama is a year, and he didn't want any more of those stories that, it took a year of a reporter's time to actually deliver something he could put in the paper. And, I was joking around that time that we had just published a series of articles by David Barstow that was a llama and a half.
Right. You are, journalistically speaking, pro-llama.
I'm pro-llama.
As far as that goes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pro-llama except, when you sort of enter the 9th month of the gestation period, I have been known to go around to the reporter's desk and say, what gives?
Come on.
Are we going to actually see a story here?
I got it.
But yes, I'm pro-llama.
Pro-llama, okay. Let me go back to the measures of success. We talked about circulation. Let's talk about the degree to which the pay model, the so-called metered model that you all instituted earlier this year, is working. This was a long in planning, long in discussion switch from,
agonizing.
And I'm sure very agonizing, and I want you to talk about that, from a scenario in which I, as a non-subscriber, a non-paying customer, had access to the New York Times, all of its riches, all of its offerings, wherever, whenever, for free, to a place now where I don't exactly have to pay for them immediately, but after a certain number of tries. I described it to you yesterday as the drug pusher school of marketing.
Right.
Give them a little bit to get them hooked, give them a taste for free.
Give them the gateway drug.
The gateway drug.
Right.
So the New York Times as gateway drug, I love that concept. And then eventually you make them pay. And that's kind of what you're doing really now.
Yeah, that's the model we ended up with after a lot of experimentation and a lot of gnashing of teeth and wringing of hands.
Why'd you finally do it?
Because we were convinced that that's the only way that the paper will survive and grow again in the long term. I mean, the print newspaper is to this day pretty healthy financially, not as healthy as it once was. That we're still in the long tail of a recession, if not the beginning of a second recession.
Yep.
And advertisers have hunkered down. And as you noted earlier, circulation has gone down, although we keep raising the price, and that somewhat offsets that. But the print newspaper, for all that, is pretty stable financially. But you know that isn't going to last forever, and it's not going to start growing again. So the only place for growth is in online, where the audience is growing, the demand is growing.
In fact, you said at the beginning of the metered model being put into place that you would hope to have 300,000 customers,
paying
customers digitally as a consequence of this by the end of the first year. And within, I think, 4 months, you had 240,000 people who had signed up for it. I'd say that was trending toward a success.
Yeah. Now, the one thing you never know is, does that mean that it's going to keep going up and up and up, or does it mean it just got to the plateau faster than we anticipated?
Right.
But yeah, I'm not in the message traffic loop for the updates on how it's doing, but I do run into the guys who monitor it in the cafeteria from time to time, and I always ask, and
they seem to be happier.
They seem to be very happy.
Right.
I mean, we make a lot of money in online advertising, and the big business debate was, if you start charging, are you going to lose so many readers who don't want to pay because everybody thinks that everything is free on the internet, that advertisers will run away too. So you may be charging people money, but you're going to be losing lucrative advertising because you don't have the audience anymore.
Well, it's a risk, always.
It is a risk.
Yeah.
But so far, we seem to have found, knock on wood, the right formula.
Now, I asked you, why did you do this? And you said, because we concluded that it was the only way for this to go. Do you feel the same way about other newspapers? In other words, if we have newspapers in Austin or Texas who have made the decision not to put their content behind a paywall, as porous as it may be, are they making a mistake in not doing that?
I'm a little careful about prescribing, anything for other newspapers, but especially their business models, since that's not my upbringing. I'm a journalist, not a business guy. It was clearly the right choice for the Times.
Right.
The Boston Globe, which we own, has gone into a somewhat more complicated online pay model that seems so far to be working. But people will only pay if they feel a loyalty to what you're giving them or a sense that it's irreplaceable.
Right.
I actually think that there's great potential for good local newspapers to charge for their online content, because, and in a funny way, the localer you get, the better that prospect is.
More intimate, right?
Right, because you may not care all that much about what's happening 100 miles away from where you live, but you care a lot about what's happening in 10 blocks from where you live, and how it's governed, and at that level, you care about the high school football scores, you care about the zoning commission decisions, you care about what the cops are, who they've arrested this week.
Might well pay for that.
Yes, you might well pay for that.
You said I'm a journalist, so let's talk about journalism, okay? The other measure of success during your tenure as editor was the paper won 16, is that right? 18 Pulitzer.
Counting.
Who's counting? You're apparently counting. 18 Pulitzer Prizes, and the paper over time has more Pulitzer Prizes than any other paper. So obviously a lot of work that was recognized outside of the paper. When you look back on those 8 years and you think about the journalism that you were sort of in the driver's seat in publishing, what things stand out? What made you proudest during that time you editor?
Yeah, I should preface this by saying that every year on Pulitzer Day, I give a speech saying it's not about prizes.
Right. But secretly it is, isn't it?
Well, I mean, at some level it is. But, it's a little dangerous to start thinking too much about prizes, because you don't want to be, making choices about what you cover based on what's going to...
Well, let's talk about stories then. Forget about the prizes. What journalism that you produced are you proudest of during the time as editor?
Oh, dear. There is a lot of it, and it happened on my watch, and I was lucky. Journalism is a bottom-up business mostly.
Right.
Editors don't go to work and say, it would be really great if we went out and covered this. Mostly, reporters come in and say, this is going on, we should cover it. And every once in a while, an editor contributes, a sense of direction, or requests a follow-up, or notices something somewhere else. But, it's mostly not editors who are...
But it's not a spectator sport, though, either.
No. We get to kibitz fairly forcibly on what we cover.
Yeah.
I would not want to try and make a top 10 list, but just recently, I think our coverage of the Arab Spring has been... that's an interesting story overall, because I think there has been a lot of good coverage from a lot of places that had retrenched on foreign coverage. Mm-hmm. And I think, as a general rule, people who follow American news have been well served in coverage of the Arab Spring. I think ours has been particularly exceptionally good. It's been good online, and it's been good on the ground. and our advantage is that we have people. I mean, a lot of places have done a pretty good job deploying firemen from the States, the Home Office, or maybe the London Bureau, if they have a London Bureau anymore. People who long ago gave up having a Cairo Bureau, and they've done good work. But our advantage is that we have correspondents who have been there, worked there for a long time, know their way around, know the nuances, because it's, my litmus test of whether coverage is really good is whether they grasp how complicated it is and still and don't feel the need to sort of boil it down to black and white, because most stories are not. So I was proud of that. I was proud of of our coverage of the financial crisis, which was extremely good. I'm proud of some excellent investigative work we've done on a whole range of issues. Health hazards in imports from China, for example. That one did win some prizes. It's sort of, if you get me started, I just won't stop.
Well, I understand.
It's like, which of your children do you love best?
Right, but as you know, you love some children on some days more equally than others, and so I'm asking you to make that hard choice. But I grant you, you've named a bunch of things. What's interesting to me is you've not named anything in sports. You've not named anything in the arts, and with the exception of the financial collapse, you've not named anything in business. Were you more focused on foreign and domestic news at the exclusion of the other sections?
No, I'll give you I was on the verge of giving you one from sports before I decided if you stop me before I
let's have it.
Filibuster the whole evening. We and one reporter in particular broke the story about the danger of concussions in sports, and it took.
This was Alan
Schwartz.
Alan Schwartz did a terrific series of stories.
Over the course of about 3 years, and the first year or so, he was persona non grata in major sports, mostly football. People didn't want to talk to him. The people who make a mint off of sports, ESPN, Sports Illustrated, didn't want to go anywhere near the story. And he recognized that something really important was going on. Right. And that it was not just professional sports athletes who were making a lot of money, it was at the high school level. He's just by persistent reporting, finding new angles on it, he sort of forced that story onto the national agenda. And he's probably saved some lives. He certainly
in fact, others, Malcolm Gladwell and others have come in behind him.
They have, and
on the heels of his reporting.
And Malcolm gave due credit to Alan.
Right. Do you consider the sports and arts and other sort of section coverage to be as integral to the success of the Times as a newspaper as you do the stuff we think of more traditionally?
I do. I mean, I'm supposed to say that, but I actually...
You actually do believe it?
I actually do say that. I mean, it's been a long time since I read any survey data on why it is that people across the country subscribe to the New York Times, a New York newspaper, ostensibly. Right. But back when we used to do those surveys, the two things that popped up on the top of the charts for why somebody in Chicago or San Francisco would subscribe to the New York Times were foreign coverage and culture, particularly serious culture, serious art, right. Classical music, architecture, but not only. I mean, popular arts as well. So yeah, I think that is. Doing that stuff well is as much a part of who we are as doing Cairo well. Okay,
so you've given us a list of things, a short list, abbreviated list, an abridged list of the things you like. Tell us something you'd like to have back.
Boy, I didn't blot those out of my mind.
Yeah, I bet you did, Bill.
And
it's okay, we have time.
And there's a long list of them because we publish corrections in the paper every single day, and there are...
But I don't mean a mistake. I mean something that turned out as a story to be the wrong decision to publish a story. Not that you made the right decision, but it was executed poorly. I mean something you think, well, that was just a mistake. We shouldn't have done that.
Well, let me give you one that will sound like it's copying out because it wasn't on my watch, but in the end, it was ultimately my responsibility and I'm the one who screwed it up. Going into the war in Iraq, when I was actually in exile from the newsroom, happy exile, writing columns and things, we ran this is widely known, we ran some pretty bad stories, credulous stories about the potential threat of weapons of mass destruction in
This
Iraq.
Is the first Judith Miller controversy.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Just to orient people.
You could call it that.
I will.
Although the problem stories were not all hers. So I think it's a little unfair to use that shorthand, because it was a failing of the paper. And that kind of screw up is a systemic screw up, not an individual screw up, because
Fair.
we have safety net upon safety net to prevent that sort of thing happening.
And those things failed in this case.
And those things failed in this
Right.
case. My culpability in this is, when I became executive editor in July of 2003, it was pretty well known that we had published some bad stuff. I don't buy the idea that the New York Times sent America to war through its bad coverage. I don't think that President Bush and Vice President Cheney were waiting for permission from the New York Times to go invade Iraq.
Hardly.
But it matters. It matters a lot when you make a mistake on a matter of life and death like war. And what I should have done when I came into office was sit down right away, go over the record, and explain to readers, here's what we got wrong, here's how we got it wrong, we screwed up. Because that self-correcting mechanism is absolutely essential to your trust, and your trust is all you've got.
And you believed that at the time you took over as editor?
That the stuff was wrong.
That you had screwed up, and
right.
that there was a breach of trust.
I waited more than a year to do that, and let the damage fester, and I think that was a serious blunder on my part.
And if you could do it over, you would have done it at the moment you became editor?
I would have done it at the moment that I mean, the reason I didn't was more of a sentimental one. I mean, I came in after the paper had just endured a pretty wrenching scandal. The Jason Blair, young reporter fabricating stories,
right.
Cost my predecessor his job. And the newsroom was pretty badly demoralized by all of that. And my heart said, I can't hit them with another, big failure on top of that. But that was a bad call.
Right. There were other ones I know that were controversial, and maybe at the time you wondered if you were doing the right thing, or maybe not. One you and I have discussed privately, is the warrantless wiretapping story that found you on the couch of the Oval Office being
Right.
told by President Bush, in so many words, you may have blood on your hands as a result of the story.
That's right. I actually, to this day, get hammered from both right and left for that story. From the right, because we held that story for a year, a little more than a year, before we actually published it. And then, I get it from the left for holding the story, and from the right for publishing the story.
To be clear, you held it across the 2004 election cycle so as not to impact the outcome of the election.
That's not why.
But there was a consideration of the election in not publishing it, or there was not?
There was not.
That's the criticism of the left, I'm saying. The left says you held it so that you didn't impact the election. You should have done it before the election.
The kind of the left conspiracy theory is that we just didn't want to interfere with the election. I mean, if that were true, we would have published it a month after the election instead of a year after the election.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, there was another rather major embarrassment to the administration about a cache of high explosives in Iraq, which the military failed to secure, and which was looted, possibly by terrorists, which we published 4 days before the election. So, and we're accused by the president's supporters of trying to sabotage this election. So you don't win either way.
Right.
But in the end, we did publish the story on warrantless wiretapping after. It wasn't just the president. I mean, the president was the kind of final appeal. But I think the Washington bureau chief and I talked to most members of the cabinet. We talked to the head of the CIA. We talked to a lot of people. They very much did not want us to publish that information. And we face these questions of whether or not to publish sensitive information, not every day, but on a fairly regular basis. And when we choose not to publish for national security reasons, you don't know that because we didn't publish.
Right.
When we choose to publish, it becomes a controversy.
Were there instances during your time as editor when you chose not to publish sensitive information for national security reasons?
Yes, there were 3 or 4 of them.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll give you an example that I can talk about because it's there's no harm in talking about it now.
Right.
The first time I ever had, actually I was foreign editor at the time. The first time that I agreed to sit on a story was our crack military affairs correspondent Michael Gordon learned that this was after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the former Soviet Republic of Georgia was one of several republics that had large caches of fissile material, nuclear, either weapons grade or nearly weapons grade fissile material. Yes. And this particular cache in Georgia was a matter of concern, A, because Georgia's in the Caucasus, which is a little rough and tumble, and B, because it was completely unsecured. It was sitting there waiting for somebody to come steal it. And the US government had tried very hard in negotiating with both Moscow and the Georgian government for permission to come in and secure this stuff, had not been able to get it. We were told, give us some time to get this stuff secure, do not advertise the fact.
If you report this, you're basically saying terrorists come here.
Yeah,
right.
And of course we didn't publish it, and they did eventually get agreement to go in and secure this stuff. Right. At which point we did write a story.
Why was that the right call at that moment, but on the warrantless wiretapping or on WikiLeaks, another instance of you publishing stuff that people perceive to be against the national interest? Why was that the right call there? It wasn't the right call in the case of Georgia, but it was the right call in the case of these others. I'm just wondering what your calculus is.
Well, there isn't a calculus. I mean, there's not a formula, except in the sort of crudest sense, you are weighing risk against news value, I guess. In the case of the warrantless wiretapping story, the calculation that I ultimately made was the fact that the United States does everything in its power to eavesdrop on bad guys is pretty obvious. And if anything, the people in Al-Qaeda assume that we do it regardless of what the law says. So the real question was not, are we eavesdropping whenever possible on bad guys? Of course we were, and should be, I guess. The real question was, were we doing it according to the law, which was set up. The law was set up to protect Americans against unwarranted invasion of their privacy. And the law basically said that if you want to do a wiretap in which one party is in the United States, you go to a court. Special court was set up, expedited procedure, almost always said yes. But you had a judge giving an important veneer of legality to this process. They were bypassing the court and just doing it, which a number of people in the administration and outside of it, but in the Justice Department, felt was a violation of the law.
And in fact, you perceive the story to be a story not about wiretapping, but a story about the law.
It was a story about warrants and about the law. Yeah.
Right. It was the warrantless part that bothered you, not the wiretapping.
Yeah. That was, there are people who were in the administration, people I respect who, to this day I think disagree with that call. And it's not a decision that we ever make lightly. Right. That's one that I feel comfortable with.
Say a word or two about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks.
Do I have to?
You have to. You absolutely have to, because I want to know why, in retrospect, that seems to have been a good idea to you. I'm not saying I don't think it was, but a lot of people question the judgment call you made in that case.
Okay. I mean, the reason I cringe a little bit is because I think that the price of dealing with Julian Assange is that for eternity you're sentenced to be on panel discussions where people ask about the significance of WikiLeaks.
Right, okay. We'll make this the last time. How about that?
Okay. Look, I'll preface this by saying it's the government's job to keep its secrets. It's not our job to keep their secrets for them. Our job is to publish stuff, and if it's interesting and newsworthy, our default position is we publish it. You've got to kind of persuade us there's a good reason not to.
Right.
And in the case of WikiLeaks, WikiLeaks was very complicated. It was four rounds of information over the course of almost a year. The first two having to do with military dispatches from the field in first Afghanistan, then Iraq. The third and most controversial, or certainly the noisiest, was State Department diplomatic cables between the State Department and its embassies and consulates all over the world, a huge cache of documents. And then the fourth one was files with information about Guantanamo. With each one of those, we first question was, is this information authentic? Is it real? And we ascertained that it was. And actually, nobody's ever said that it wasn't, but you do want to know that you're dealing with real stuff. Second of all, does it tell us something? Does it tell us something about what the government is doing in our name? And to various degrees, in each of those cases, the answer was very much yes. And that's just thinking about an American audience. That, there was an international audience for a lot of this stuff, where the news value, localized news value in Tunisia, for example, about how the Tunisian government was spending its largesse, actually played some contributing role in the beginning of the Arab Spring. So, yes, it was real stuff. Yes, it was interesting, important, of news value. And then the final question is, if we're going to use this stuff, we're going to use it responsibly. There may be things in here that we don't think should be published. We knew from the get-go that we were going to take out the name of any confidential informant.
So you did some redacting?
We did a lot of redacting.
Yeah.
And obviously, very obviously, I have no control over what WikiLeaks does. Although, interestingly enough, WikiLeaks sort of started out with the idea that they were just going to dump all these documents whenever the date was that we'd agreed we would publish our articles. They were just going to unload everything. And we said, look, we don't tell you how to do your job. You're just a source, but that would be really irresponsible. And in the first data dump, they did actually publish some documents that had names of Afghan civilians who had talked to the American military. And to their surprise, I don't think they really cared whether the New York Times approved of that or not.
Right.
But they got a backlash from a lot of groups that I think they considered kind of kindred spirits. Amnesty International said, what are you doing here?
Right.
These are innocent people who just happened to pop up in a federal, a U.S. military report, and you could get them killed. So after that, they became more willing to go along with, our attitude towards redacting
the fact, I asked you this yesterday, the fact that they were purloined documents is really not of any consequence to you. As you pointed out, so were the Pentagon Papers.
So were the Pentagon Papers, yeah. Anytime we get secret information from a government or from another institution, there is an element of, or at least there's a question about whether we have been in receipt of stolen goods.
Yep.
And we certainly think about that. But in the end, it's about the value of the material as journalism.
Got it. I want to ask you a couple more things before we open it up for the audience. We're running a little longer than I wanted, but I want to keep going on this if we can. Okay. The public editor, a creation of your tenure in response to what was perceived by the paper itself to be a need to self-cleanse
yes.
after some issues. You've had 4 public editors at the paper.
Mm-hmm.
Is this I'm asking a question I know the answer to, but I'm going to ask it for dramatic effect. Do you wish you could have that one back, the creation of the public editor?
Well, my enthusiasm for this exercise has diminished over the years, let us say. For a long time, the New York Times was not by any means the first newspaper to have this kind of device. A lot of the Washington Post has had an ombudsman, for forever.
Right.
The Times always sort of got up on its high horse and said, well, we, the editors, are the representatives of the readers, and it's our job to make sure that we keep the paper straight. After the Jason Blair episode, with a sense that we had done some serious harm to our credibility, we decided that, maybe there would be some value in paying a guy, giving him space in the pages of the Times to critique us.
And completely independent from everybody at the Times.
Completely independent.
Cannot tell him who to talk to, cannot tell him what to publish.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I supported that decision. I actually, I obviously haven't loved everything that the public editors have written, and I've never hesitated to say so. That the job doesn't come with, a promise that the editor of the paper will always be nice to you. And we've had some loud conversations over specific stories, a few of which I remember.
Do you think the public editor has treated the New York Times fairly during these years?
For the most part, yes.
The office of as opposed to specifically.
Yeah. No, I think in most cases, yes. I mean, when I've disagreed with them, it's been a matter of interpretation or judgment, but not. I don't question their good faith. I mean, the four people that have held that job take it very seriously.
Right.
They report very hard. They try to get every point of view they can, often including mine, and then they, let the chips fall where they may.
The reality is that the scrutiny is probably a very good thing for you from an internal standpoint, and from an external view of the Times standpoint.
A mixed blessing.
It's pretty good. Well, no, but it's probably pretty good that you all are willing to subject yourselves to this, right?
It is. I think
it's like a physician heal thyself kind of moment, right?
I think the analogy you used yesterday was proctology.
It is proctology. It's a proctological examination of your work.
Yes. Well, even proctology has its good results too, as uncomfortable as it may sometimes be. I think in terms of our credibility, it is mostly a good thing. I think people do see that there is this independent voice in the paper, occasionally slapping us around the room. On the other hand, there is this one downside of it, is that when the public editor takes the side of an aggrieved party, that aggrieved party waves the public editors. Even the public editor of the New York Times says that this story is wrong, unfair, slanderous, whatever.
Right. It's as if you're handing a loaded gun to your enemy.
Yes.
In some ways. Yes. Before we open it up for questions, I promise this is the last one. You are now a writer. You've transitioned back from being an editor to your roots as a writer.
After all those years of saying, there's way too much opinion out there in journalism land, we should stick with reporting, I'm back to being an opinion writer.
And in the first couple of weeks as an opinion writer, you earned the ire of both Arianna Huffington and Fox News. Perhaps the only moment of their common ground in history.
Right.
Was their ire directed at you?
Yeah, well, I've had the ire of Fox News for a long time. I mean, even in the role of editor, I did not see it as my right to go out and express opinions on public issues, with one exception, and that's about journalism. I felt I had some authority and some right to go out and talk about journalistic ethics, journalistic business, the rise and fall, and all the issues we've been talking about tonight. Yeah. And I have on more than one occasion taken Fox to task, not for being a conservative cable news network, which is entirely their right, but for letting the conservative opinions insinuate themselves quite a bit into their news programs, and pretending that was not happening. It was not. I don't fault them for being conservative. I fault them for being hypocritical.
Hypocritical.
Hippocratic's the proctology.
That's
thing.
We're back on the proctology. Right. We've moved to the next topic. Right. What I want to know is, what did you learn as editor that you've kind of carried forward and has now perhaps made you a better or a different writer as you embark on this old phase of your career?
One thing I learned is a lot more respect for editors. I mean, I realize that sounds self-serving, but I've already, even before I left the executive editor job and took this op-ed column writing job, I began to write a column for the magazine. And again, I talked mostly about press-related issues. Yeah. I did not write about war and peace and economics and social issues and things like that. And I've forgotten where
you were going. Where new appreciation for editors.
Oh, right. And it was it was the first time in 8 years that I had been submitting my work to the mercies of editors, and I found I was immensely grateful for what they did. I mean, they caught mistakes that I had overlooked. Yep. They, again, good editors. There are bad editors too, but I found there's real value, even aside from not letting you say outrageous things in print, just making your stuff better.
Process works.
The process, yeah, when it works well, it's a great thing.
Good. We should stop. We'll bring the lights up and invite you all into the conversation. Perhaps someone will ask, as I didn't have time to, why the Saturday puzzle is so hard. Something I've always wondered. We have microphones in the aisles. Let me ask that you line up at the microphones. We'll call on you and we'll go for a bit here. And when it feels like we should stop, we'll stop. Sir.
Yes. This way. Yes, Mr. Keller, we really appreciate, I appreciate the New York Times. It's great as far as a content perspective. But I really have been admiring you guys from an innovation as far as technology is concerned. I mean, you guys have been on the forefront with your readers, with your iPad application and things. The challenge that I see in a lot of the local news organizations is they can't keep up with the technology. ESPN has been trying on the online aspect kind of a localized version of their content where you have like the Dallas ESPN or Chicago ESPN. Has the New York Times ever considered something like that for localized versions, using your technology but still localized?
Yes, a little bit. Actually, our partnership with the Texas Tribune is a local partnership. We have three of similar partnerships. One with Evan's operation here in Texas, and the deal is basically that a couple times a week. In Texas, you get a Texas edition, which has 4 extra pages of news that we've selected from the work of the Tribune. We have similar operations in the San Francisco Bay Area and in Chicago. The economic rationale for that is essentially to slightly increase print circulation, which makes money, and the business side, people say it seems to be working. But it only works if you have a critical mass of a potential print circulation audience, which means we're not going to be doing this in a lot of small venues around the place. As for I really appreciate what you said about the innovation because the one thing I winced at when Mark introduced me was his reference to the Gray Lady. That some of us kind of collect Gray Lady references to the New York Times. The Gray Lady comes from a day when the New York Times was literally gray. We didn't even have color pictures, and sort of gray in tone, and meaning kind of dinosaur-like. And one of the things that I'm proudest of that's happened over the last 10 years is that we have become much more experimental and innovative, forced to by necessity, but I think for once we recognized what was happening early. We integrated our newsroom so the same people are doing, it used to be there was a little digital rump out here and then this great big print newsroom, and most reporters didn't even think about the website. It was just another place that did something with their stories. And now it is, everybody thinks about
Well, it's
digital.
fully integrated, right?
It is a fully integrated newsroom, and we have some of the most just delightful, talented people, most of them a lot younger than me, who have tried new things in interactive graphics, video, different ways of telling stories, different ways of presenting the news. And I think, it requires a big investment to do that. So I understand why a lot of local newspapers have fallen behind. But I think, as time goes on, to some extent, those developments tend to trickle down. Once upon a time, doing a blog was a very complicated thing. Now, WordPress is something you can basically buy off the shelf, teach somebody to use in a very short time, and they're a blogger. So that'll happen with the rest of the technologies too, I expect.
You mentioned earlier that the New York Times makes a lot of money from your digital properties. As I understand the economics, it's the proverbial trading print dollars for digital dimes. Do you believe that there'll be enough digital dimes to continue to fund the kind of quality journalism that the New York Times offers? And when do you think that will happen? And will it happen before the print dollars fade away?
Do you accept the premise of the question? Maybe is what I should ask you first.
Well, that is certainly the universal belief that you get that print rewards you richly per copy, that you get dimes out of digital, but you get a lot of dimes because the scale is so vast.
Well, and you've said that the advertising online for the Times has been significant.
It has been significant. Right. We don't charge nearly as much for an ad on the homepage of the website as we do for, say, a full page in the A-book of the print newspaper. So the basic, it is true. We are trading, high-priced ad space for vast scale and comparatively low-priced ad space. You've asked the sort of great existential question of the news business. At what point are you generating enough revenues from digital that you don't need the print revenues to support the newsroom? And not every news organization will survive that transition.
In fact, no one's figured it out yet, right?
Right. A lot of them. If we stop publishing the print newspaper tomorrow, admittedly, a lot of costs would go away. We wouldn't have paper costs and printing plants to maintain and delivery trucks to pay for. But we would not be able to support a newsroom budget of something like $200 million, 1,100 people. It would entail some fairly drastic cutbacks to the newsroom. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, my hope and I think guess is that those lines will cross, and we will have enough revenue between the subscriptions that we're charging online and the online advertising to support something that I would be proud to call the New York Times.
But you're not saying the paper.
Do I know that? No.
The paper's not going to go away, though.
Well, the paper may be. You can still buy vinyl records. The paper may become a kind of boutique product. You go and pay $50 for your Sunday New York Times because you love it so much, and we sell, a very limited quantity of them. I do think that there's a lot of affection for the print paper that will keep it alive for a considerable number of years. When, I don't know. I'm sure that we've commissioned McKinsey or Bain or somebody to do these projections, but A, I haven't read them, and B, I wouldn't believe them.
Please continue the print copy. I have followed Chris Hedges for some time. He worked for your paper for about 16 years. Mm-hmm. But before that, his background is very interesting. He went to divinity school, graduated, but did not become a minister. Mm-hmm. And I think that early on he expressed a lot of strong remarks or strong, maybe printing about the Iraq and Afghanistan war. He was definitely against it. Mm-hmm. Was that a big no-no for early on, and that your paper did let him go for those expressions, however they were? Could you comment on Chris?
I think what you said is about 75% right. And Chris, I knew Chris quite well when he worked at the paper. Liked him very much and admired him. He's a smart and in some ways wise man. He reached a point where he found the Times constraints on voicing your opinions in our pages something that he couldn't live with. He wanted to be an opinion writer, and that's fine. But you can't be an opinion writer in the news pages of the New York Times. You got to go off and do something else. So he went off and wrote books, and he does online stuff, and he does freelance writing and public speaking. You can take the boy out of the divinity school, but you never take the divinity school out of the boy. He's still got a kind of, I think, moral cause that he sees, and it is very much. Saying it's anti-war is to kind of diminish it in a funny way, because it's not. He's absolutely fascinated by the visceral appeal that war generates in journalists, among others, and there's some truth in that.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yes.
Hello. I have two questions for you. One question to Bill Keller as a book reviewer and writer, and second question to Bill Keller as a former editor. First question is, if New York Times Book Review asked you to review Ron Suskind's book, Confidence Man, what would you write? And second question is the thought process behind your decision to publish stories about extramarital affairs of John McCain in 2008.
You may want to take the Suskind one first at length
No, I'm going to take the Moseskin one first and briefly. First of all, I have bought his book. I have it sitting on my desk, and I haven't read it, so I'm certainly not going to try and review it, sight unseen. I mean, if they'd asked me to review it, if I had the time, I probably would have been interested in doing it. He's an interesting writer. The John McCain story is one that I had in mind when we were talking earlier about the public editor, because the public editor, as John McCain will be happy to tell you, disagreed with our call on that. I felt at the time and still feel that the story was not about John McCain. I have no idea whether John McCain had an extramarital affair, and that was not the point of the story. What the story said was, and what we had very good reason to believe was true, was that Senator McCain's relationship with a particular lobbyist was flirtatious and cozy to a degree that made his staff very uncomfortable. And his staff did a couple of things. They confronted the senator and said, "You're going to embarrass yourself. Don't do this. It just looks bad. We don't know what's going on, but it looks really bad." We also know that they took steps to limit her access to his office. And she, by the way, lobbied on issues that were before the Commerce Committee, which he was the chairman of. So the potential embarrassment wasn't just, the suggestion that he was doing something that his wife wouldn't approve of, but doing something that the voters wouldn't approve of. I thought, particularly given John McCain's, and I should say I've spent some time before this. I spent some time with John McCain on the campaign trail. I've always found him an absolutely fascinating fellow. He was one of those rare politicians, when during the campaign season you'd get in the back of the bus with him, 3 or 4 reporters sit around a table with McCain. You could ask him anything, and he would give you not a kind of canned campaign speech, but a thoughtful answer. He was one of those rare politicians who would go out and say things that he knew was going to make the audience angry, but he said them because he believed them. So I have, at the time when we published that story, it was a story about somebody that I actually admired, which was kind of the point, because, McCain's career arch, and I don't mean to go on forever about this, but McCain's career arch suffered a major downfall when he was involved in the savings and loan scandal. And he resurrected his career from that and made a point of honor, a point of restoring his honor. So here's a guy whose whole career arc is defined by honor. And in his book, he writes about this a lot, including, it's not enough to just be clean. You have to seem clean. The appearance of conflict of interest is actually a real hazard to a politician. So in that context, the fact that he had, behaved in a way that set off those sorts of ethical alarm bells with his own staff, I thought was a legitimate story. If I went back and looked at it, I might have figured out a way to write it differently so that people wouldn't have seized on it as a story about, is John McCain cheating on his wife? Right. Because that wasn't the intention. Right. I have a 14-year-old daughter who went with me to a Q&A when she was 11, I think, and I did one of these back and forths, and afterwards I said, "Well, Molly, how was it?" And he said, "It was fine, Dad, but I just want to say, shorter answers."
14-year-old daughters have a way.
Clearly she has less influence on me than she should.
They have a way, sir. We'll just do a couple more here, and then we're going to call this. Mark, we're okay to take a couple more? Great.
Here's for Bill Keller, reporter, a short question. From when to when were you in Johannesburg, and are there 1 or 2 stories from the time that you were there that kind of still stick with you?
I was there from the spring of '92 until the summer of '95. So just to put that in events context, when I arrived, Nelson Mandela and a lot of other groups and the white government were in the course of negotiations on a new constitution. So it was obvious that white rule was going to end. It wasn't obvious how or whether it would be particularly bloody or peaceful or what. And when I left, it was 1 year into Nelson Mandela's presidency. I have so many memories of South Africa. I have to say this is, unusually for me, a lot of them actually revolve around the famous people. And normally the stories you cherish are the ones, and I have some of those too from South Africa. I mean, stories that I was just very, that I loved because I thought they touched a sort of human chord about individual people that you've never heard of before. But so much of it's very hard to separate South Africa from Mandela. I'm a hard-bitten reporter. I covered Gorbachev, who's coming here to speak. I covered Boris Yeltsin. I covered Andrei Sakharov and a number of other people in the Soviet Union who were, larger than life. The only one that person that I've covered that I, unabashedly say was heroic is Mandela, and that's actually not because he went to prison. Spent 27 years of his life in prison. I actually know, remarkably, a number of people who spent a lot of time in prison for what they believed in. What makes Mandela heroic to me is that he is what he did after he got out. I've known a number of dissidents who, when they actually were no longer dissidents and got some power and were called upon to actually be politicians, had no idea how to do it. They were moral avatars, but they didn't know how to compromise and how to make things happen. Mandela did, and the reason that South Africa, made the transition. It's not a perfect place by a long shot, even now, but the reason it made it transition without a bloody civil war is because he was a politician. So, I don't think of politician necessarily as a dirty word.
Let's go there and there. I see we have one person who snuck up behind you. We're going to have to make these all quick if we can. Okay, so go ahead.
I'm tempted to ask you if you have any books about Winnie Mandela that you'd like to recommend, but I think I'll go on.
Actually, do you know the answer to that question?
Yes, I do.
My wife wrote a biography of Winnie Mandela, and it's excellent.
We won't count that one, but ask a quick one. So.
All right. Yeah. This goes back to what I call your buyer's remorse article about your own involvement with the Iraq coverage. Yeah. I read it rather carefully, and I was struck by the fact that there was no mention by you, or if there was, I missed it, of paying attention to how public figures broke on this. You seem to be saying, well, yeah, I believe that. How could I not? And yet the Paul Wellstones and the guy from Wisconsin, I'm losing my mind.
Russ Feingold.
Russ Feingold were on the side of saying, don't believe this, and the John Kyles and Kay Bailey Hutchinsons are the ones that were took the position you did. I'm wondering, did you ignore where?
No, I didn't. But those, neither the people who were in favor of invading Iraq nor the people that specific people you've named who were opposed to it were decisive in my own thinking this through. I was influenced by a lot of people, but not particularly by politicians who were doing exactly what you would expect them to do. I was more influenced by the fact that a lot of Democrats whom you would normally expect to be skeptical of something like invading Iraq subscribed to the idea that Saddam Hussein was a threat. It was, I think I said in that piece that there was a near consensus, and that's true. There were some dissenting voices who were, in hindsight, a lot smarter than I was, and a lot smarter than the supporters of the war in general were. But the belief that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction was quite widespread, bipartisan, and actually based on something. It was based on bad intelligence, but bad intelligence that came from agencies that had gotten Saddam Hussein wrong before. And the last time they got him wrong was underestimating his weapons capability. So they overcompensated and said, well, we're pretty sure he has an active program, when he didn't. But after the first Gulf War, when inspectors went in, they found that he had a quite well-developed nuclear weapons program that nobody had known about. So they overcompensated. So there's an explanation for why people got it wrong, that doesn't excuse the fact that they and I got it wrong. Yes?
Hi. Sometimes when the nature of reading the newspaper online is so unfocused that you come away feeling a little motion sick almost. Is there a way that when you read the newspaper that you are deliberate about it, so you come away feeling like you're thinking about something and not like you're unhinged?
You sound to me like a perfect customer for the print newspaper. Either that or Dramamine. I don't mean to. I'm not trying to make fun of your question. I just honestly don't know how to answer.
You have no answer.
Well, I'm saying that when the nature of reading online is that you skim a lot, and I think it's fair to say it's true of a lot of people, and you click around, and words are linked, and that's a good thing. But on the other hand, it means that after 20 minutes of sitting at the computer, you stand up and you're like, what just happened?
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, as former editor of the New York Times, if there's a way that when you sit down to read the newspaper, which I don't know how often you do that as a reader, you're deliberate about how you're reading articles in order to make it the nourishing experience that I remember when I was young.
So as not to feel sick.
Well, I mean, there's a fair amount of effort and thought that goes into trying to design the homepage and the article pages so that we're giving some visual cues as to what's important and where your attention should go. We're a long way from being perfect at that. I think we're better than we used to be. I mean, I spent some time at the journalism school at the university today, and they were curious about the same subject. You know, how do people read online? What do we know about how younger people read as opposed to how the older generation reads? And the fact is, we don't really know very much. Most of the experience we have is like yours. It's anecdotal, and people skip around and tend not to read long things. I hesitate to make kind of sweeping generalizations about how people consume news online.
What about you?
Well, I read differently now than I did a month ago, because I tend to have specific things I know that I want to write about that I'm focused on. So I graze a little bit more. I used to try and read a lot of stuff in depth online, and in fact, it's in the early days of the web online, the conventional wisdom was everybody's going to just read nuggets. Nobody wants to read long stuff online, and then using the kind of crude metrics that we have, or things like the most emailed list or the most viewed list, we would notice that when we did a big investigative piece or a long kind of piece of narrative journalism, it would almost always pop up high on those lists. So people, in fact, were reading long things online. So I still think we're learning, but I wasn't joking about if you feel like you have not satisfied your craving for the news online. I mean, the print newspaper's home delivered in Austin.
See, he's still working it,
I'm
even though
still
he's not the
selling
editor
it.
anymore. Okay, last question. I hope it's something fast like Yankees versus Mets, but go ahead.
Sure.
You think that would be a fast answer?
It would be a fast answer. Well, you just say Red Sox, and then we could all leave. So go ahead.
Right.
Mr. Keller, it seems to me that in the world of traditional journalism, information, particularly good information, has been the thing that's been in demand. But with the advent of the internet, I think that relationship has been flipped, and that information is everywhere, and that people's attention is now the thing that's in demand. Do you think that this is going to lead to a rise in sensational journalism or attention-grabbing stories?
It's a really good last question.
It is. I think it already has. I think if you were to survey the upstarts in the online business, first of all, you'd find that 99.9% of them have an audience of about 2, but among the ones that have a serious audience, you would find that they skew heavily towards opinion. They're bloggers or websites that have either an ideological or a very strong personal point of view, aim to be provocative, or that they are sensational in the sense that they are kind of big, overblown headlines, or sensational in the sense that they're making a lot more out of something than it merits in the real world. They're writing about celebrity gossip, for example. So I think the web has understandably had that effect because what the web did was it said anybody can be a publisher, anybody can be a journalist. All you need is an internet service provider, and congratulations, you are now the editor of my blog. And it's understandable that there would be a clamor for attention. Does that put some stresses on the organizations that do traditional media, where we actually care about getting the story right and drawing the right, telling people what it means accurately? Yes, it does. It does put, there is a lot of temptation out there that has to be resisted. It's a little bit easier for us because we have a pretty good idea what people come specifically to the New York Times for, and if we started writing a lot more about Paris Hilton and a lot less about Paris, France, readers would go away.
It was a magnificently constructed last sentence,
Thank
I have
you.
to say. Bill Keller, thank you all very much. That was just an absolute blast.
Thank you.